how, wasn't there something that had to do with how your name was first spelled?
Yeah, when my dad always spelled my name Doug, D-U-G, you know. I've gone by the name of Doug most of my life, which goes back to my fifth grade teacher. I believe it was my fifth grade teacher. It might have been my third grade teacher, Mrs. Dill. Mrs. Dill used to pull my hair all the time and call me Billy. And I despised the woman, so because of that I changed my name and started going by the name of Doug, because she was a very cruel lady.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to spite her.
We put Snake in her desk drawer and she had a heart attack.
She actually had a heart attack?
Yeah, she was out of school for about 6 weeks. Dick Enderle and I got her, and felt bad about it, but she had a weak heart, I guess, in the first place. But we got a paddling every day for the whole time she was out.
For 6 weeks you got a paddling every day?
Reported to Martin Nagel's office first thing in the morning, get my whack and go into class.
Future principal.
Yes.
I have a serious challenge trying to chronologically get through your life, because we already jumped to, I didn't know that you did that to a teacher. I know you did other things that were devious.
Up until the 8th grade, I was so ornery I probably would have driven most teachers crazy.
So, do you think that has any relation to how in the world did you end up in education? Is it because of the experiences you had?
No, I don't think so. It came about basically when I broke my neck. And at that time, when I got out of the hospital, I helped Stan Rickle, who was the coach at East Mansfield Elementary School, there where I'd gone to elementary. I helped Stan Rickle coach the basketball team, and really enjoyed that. And I was a bit player of in basketball when I was in high school. I played for a couple of years until my neck was broken, and then didn't try to come back into that. And that sort of had a limiting effect on some of the things that I could do in high school.
Could you empathize to some degree with students who misbehaved at all, connecting to the reasons you did when you were younger? I mean, you could at least put yourself in their shoes, couldn't you?
I don't remember why I misbehaved. I was just ornery. I was just an ornery, mischievous kid.
You didn't like to be told what to do?
Still don't like to be told what to do.
So in order to rule your universe, you had to become principal?
I suppose so. I don't know. But I like kids, and I recognize that kids are going to have some behavior problems. I don't really have a problem dealing with a kid who's just ornery. I do have a problem with dealing with a kid who is just flat out mean. And I think there's a difference between the two.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, and kids that are ornery, kids that'll pull pranks, you know, silly pranks and things like that, jokesters, they're not a big deal for me. But kids that are vicious and hurtful with words and physically, that type of thing, I have a tough time with.
Well, we're going to spend a lot of time on that later on with your educational philosophy and the things that have helped you develop the way in which you have been principal and an educator and touched a lot of people's lives. But let's talk back when you're back to the beginning, to the many places that you moved, and I want to get a sense of your childhood. So maybe if you could start telling me where you were born,
Okay.
What were the circumstances of your birth, and some of what you can remember about those early years.
Okay.
And we can also go into talking about your mom and dad and their history and their family.
Okay.
So where were you born?
I was born August 22nd, 1941, near Portsmouth, Ohio, on Beaver Creek. When I was a teenager, my dad took me back and showed me where I was born. And it was a little shack back in the woods, unpainted. And at that time, my father, Orville, was a sharecropper, worked for Bill Picklesheimer. Picklesheimer. And they lived right on the Scioto River. The guy was a big farmer. My mother, Lucy, was a housewife most of her life, a homemaker. Never really worked until after my dad broke his back, and then they started doing some cleaning business together. But
she never worked in the public workforce, but she sure as heck
Well,
worked at home.
well, early on, I guess she did work at a factory here in Mansfield for a year or so after they moved up here. I was born when my mother was quite young. I think my mom and dad were married at the age of, mom was maybe 15 or 16. My dad was several years older than she was. He might have been 23 or 24 when they were married, several years difference. And I was born, I think my mother was 17 years old, your grandmother, Lucy. Anyhow, we lived there for a while, and Mom and Dad had moved there from Kentucky. My dad was from, I believe, from Salyersville, Kentucky, and my mother's from Paintsville, or vice versa, in McLaughlin County. And they moved up here, I think, basically because there were no job opportunities. My father had been a farmer and done some work in the coal mines and in the oil fields, that type of thing, in Kentucky before they moved up. So they moved up here at my birth. They were married in 1939, August 19th, I believe. And they moved here, moved up to the Portsmouth area. And then from there, we moved around a lot. And I can't tell you exactly where the next place was, but I can tell you the places that I can remember being in. I know we made several moves back and forth to Kentucky. I can remember faintly living in a white house near the junction of Mine Fork, Literal Fork, Flat Fork in Kentucky, and it was along a creek.
So explain to me, these are curious names. So you've got Mine Fork.
These are the names
Fork?
of
How do you spell
Litteral. Mine Fork, Literal Fork, and Flat Fork. They were roadways that came in, and they came in, there was one coming in from this direction, one from this direction, another from this direction. And they were basically named for the creeks along which the roads were built. There was Flat Fork was the name of a creek, Literal Fork was the name of a creek coming in, and Mine Fork was the name of a creek. And this area that they came from, that we lived at that time, was back in an area called Wheelersburg. And it was right out in the boonies. I mean, they went over a mountainside. You had to drive over a mountainside to get into the area. And all the roads were dirt. There was one little grocery store there, owned by a guy named Ox Wheeler, and it was where the three roads came together. And Ox was called Ox Wheeler because he was as big as an ox. He was a big barrel-chested guy. Not very tall, but stout.
Right.
He owned a farm, and he was probably the wealthiest man in that area. Anyhow, we lived there for a while, and then then we moved up here and lived out on Orange Street. We lived with a family by the name of Boyd. We rented a part of a house from them or something. Orange Street is down on the north end of Mansfield. We lived there for a while.
Okay. We're just talking about places you've moved and been growing up. You're talking about the Fork area. One of the questions I have is the place you were born, is that similar, is Beaver Creek named for a creek?
Yes, Beaver Creek is one of the tributaries of the Scioto River. I was born near the Scioto River, which of course is a tributary of the Ohio River.
Were you born in a hospital?
No, I was born in the house. The doctor delivered me. I can't remember his name. It's probably on my birth certificate, but
Was a doctor, not a midwife?
it was a doctor. And he was still alive back when Dad took me down to visit, I guess. He was well into his 80s at that time. But it was kind of interesting. There was a peach tree out in the yard, and there was a little porch on the house, and it was really nothing more than a shack. I think it might have been maybe 2 rooms, maybe 3, and it's right out in the middle of the woods. I mean, it was a gorgeous setting. Very poor country, and as I said, my dad at the time was a sharecropper, and I think Picklesheimer maybe paid him a couple of bucks a week or $1 a day. I don't know what it was.
What kind of boss was he?
I don't know. Don't know.
Grandpa never said anything?
No. And he didn't work for him very long.
Uh-huh.
As I said, we stayed there for a very short period of time after my birth. Moved from there.
So
I'm
you're
not
like
sure
a
where.
year or something? How long
Maybe a year and a half. I really don't know how long we were there. All I can remember is moving to different areas. I talked about, living in the Forks and then moving to Ohio,
And the Forks were
Mansfield.
in Kentucky?
In Kentucky. That was after my birth, obviously. And then moved to Mansfield, lived on Orange Street. At that time, my dad worked for the Mansfield Tire and Rubber, and I think my mom went to work for Barnes Manufacturing for a while there.
So tell me, I mean, obviously you're not gonna know this at your point in life, but in subsequent conversations, why Mansfield? What brought people to Mansfield from Kentucky?
Industry, a lot of industry. Mansfield Tire industry was booming at the time. The steel mill was going strong. There was just a lot of industry in Mansfield, which has now left, and of course left the city in a kind of a dire straits. But after Orange Street, I think that's when we moved back to Kentucky again, and about the time Dad was drafted into the Navy. Okay?
What year was that?
That would have been probably 43 or 44.
Okay, well, you're only a couple of years old then.
Yeah, I'm not very old, but I can remember being in Kentucky. I can remember the house down on the Forks, and I couldn't have been more than a couple of years old, two and a half.
2 years.
And I can remember when Dad was in the Navy, we lived in a shack around the hillside from my grandparents' place. And I can remember Dad coming home from the Navy. We were outside, and I can remember looking across the road to the road, a dirt road, of course, and seeing him get off a bus or some kind of vehicle, and recognizing him as my father, and running down the path to meet him at the footbridge down and crossed over the creek. And that's all it was, just footbridge, footlog. And then after that, we moved back to Mansfield then. And Dad went back to work at the Mansfield Tire, where he had worked when he was drafted. And at that time, when we moved back to Mansfield, we lived, I'm not sure where we lived, to be honest with you. We lived somewhere in Mansfield. But we didn't stay here very long, and then we moved back to Kentucky, and we lived on, I think it was Mine Fork, okay?
So you moved back to the same place?
No, a different place. This was on Mine Fork, on around out toward the cemetery.
Right, but it's still part of the Three Forks.
Still part of the Three Forks. And we lived in a little house that's still there. I remember it being sided with red asbestos shingles, and sat right under a hillside. And that's where I started to, well, no, that isn't where I started school. Before we moved back to Kentucky, I do remember where we lived when we came back after Dad got out of the military. We lived down in Lucas, Ohio. And that's where I started school in Lucas in the first grade.
Okay, so what year are we at now?
I would be about 6 years old.
And you got back in like 1947 or something?
It would be about 1947, and we were living down in Lucas at the time. That's where my sister Sue was born.
Okay.
Don was born, I'm not sure where we lived when he was born here, but he was born in Mansfield in 43, so we had to be in Mansfield in 43.
So he's your second oldest. He
That's-
was your
that's
second
my-
oldest, and he was your only brother.
Right, he was born July 1943, and he was born in Mansfield, so at that time we might have lived on Orange Street at the time of his birth. So there was the move from Orange Street back to Kentucky after Dad was drafted in the military, the move back to Ohio, and we lived in Lucas on a farm. And then after Lucas, we went back to Kentucky again. That's when we lived in the place out on Mine Fork. Dad was commuting back and forth on the weekends, coming home maybe once or twice a month.
So he's still,
He's working at the tire.
since he gets back from before he goes into the service, before he's drafted, he's worked a year or two at the tire,
Right.
Mansfield Tire.
He worked for a period of time. I don't know how long it
And then he
was.
goes into the Navy where he serves.
He served the Navy for about 13, 14 months.
And then he comes back, and then he returns to that job. However, at some point, as a family, you're moved down to Kentucky.
We moved
Why
back
is
to
that?
Kentucky. I have no idea. I don't know whether it was we couldn't find a place or it was too expensive up here at the time. But we moved back to Kentucky, and Mom and Don and I lived there. And I started school there in a one-room schoolhouse. And I remember one of the kids in the one-room schoolhouse had a deformed leg from birth, and he used a wooden peg with a big piece of wood that came up on the side, and he used that to help motivate, to move it.
Yeah.
I can't remember his name, but there were seats. There would be double, triple, and fourple seats, quadruple seats, where, you know, they would be like the typical desk with a fold-up seat that was attached to the floor, but there were you could sit 4 people at them. And it was grade 1 through 8, all in the same room. Outhouse for a privy. No indoor plumbing. Wood-burning stove in the middle of the room. I went there for about a month and quit.
Why was that? Okay, you quit.
Yeah, I didn't like it, so I quit. And Don used to go to school with me, even though he wasn't supposed to be in school. He would go to school with me, and we only just a short distance up the road, so we'd walk there every day. A beautiful setting, right next to the creek, next to a cliff. Just a gorgeous setting. The school is no longer there, but I could take you to the location. But I went there for about a month, and then we started.
Was it very lush? I imagine it being very.
No, it was very crude. I mean, the vegetation and everything around it was very lush, very
Well,
wild
like
looking.
the
But the school itself was very bare. Wood floors, cold type of place.
So you started there like in the fall?
Yeah, I started there I was in the 2nd grade there, because I'd done the 1st grade in Lucas, twice.
Oh, I thought we were in Lucas.
No. We were in Lucas, we moved back to Kentucky.
Okay.
And I went to the 1st grade in Lucas 2 years, okay?
Okay, let's go back. Let's go year by year. So don't be pressed by where you moved. We'll get to that. You take me through schooling. When did you start school, and what was the experience like for you?
Well, I started school at Lucas in the 1st grade. It would have been about 1947. It was scary. I rode a school bus at least 6 miles, 7 miles into school. School bus picked me right up over the hill. And of course, we lived with my brother Don, and my sister Sue was born when I started school there. And
why was it scary?
Yeah, I guess I was kind of a, you might say, a culturally deprived kid. We were very poor. I didn't have the clothes like other kids had.
So what kind of clothing did you have?
Wore bibbed overalls, flannel shirts, heavy shoes, heavy work shoes, steel toes.
What were they called?
I don't know, I just call them clodhoppers. They had steel toes, steel plate over the toe.
So describe the plate was actually on the outside
Oh
of
yeah,
the shoe.
yeah. It kind of came under like an L, came up over the front of the shoe, and I remember wearing those to school.
Others didn't wear those to school?
No. Some kids would wear bibs, but not a whole lot. I got teased a lot because of clothes. Had a severe problem with acne at that time, so I took some razzing for that, and some abusive stuff, and that probably was the reason I hit this kid over the head with a flag and flagged his patrol boy flag, and ended up getting expelled from school in the 1st grade.
So 1st grade. So how far along were you before this incident?
March.
Okay.
It was in March. I was going over to Lucas into the little town to the pool hall to have lunch, which was a candy bar and a bottle of pop.
Was this something that you did often?
Yes.
Every day?
Every day, just about every day.
So why this day? What happened that?
Kid was just a bully, you know.
What was his job? Just describe.
He was a patrol boy. It was a street crossing, and his job was, of course, to make sure there was no traffic, put his flag out, and let you walk across the street. Well, there wasn't any traffic out there. I went across the street and put his flag up and let me cross, and started pushing me with the flag. You know, just kind of bullying me a little bit. I got a little hacked off. I always had a temper. I kicked him in the shins. He dropped his flag. I picked it up and hit him over the head with it. Then went on and had lunch. I came back. Mr. Barker was waiting there with the patrol boy, and the patrol boy says, "He's the one. He's the one." So they called my dad at the Mansfield Tire and had him come in and said, "Take him home, start him over next year," because they didn't have an expulsion process then. You know, there was no due process. They just said, "Take him on home, bring him back next year." So I had Mrs. Duncan 2 years in the 1st grade. Very nice lady, just sweet as pie. Anyhow, after we left, moved out of Lucas, after the 1st grade, after my 2nd year there, we moved back to Kentucky, and that's when I went to the one-room school for about a month in the 2nd grade. And
So you'd already been to school, this wasn't new to you?
no,
Why did you only go for a month? What,
I didn't like it, so I quit.
well, why didn't you like
It was very cold. Didn't like the classroom with grades 1 through 8, older kids all there, you know. There were some bullies and that type of thing. I just didn't, I wasn't comfortable in it, so I quit. And didn't tell Mom. I would sneak out in the morning like I was going to school and then sneak back in the back of the house and crawl in the window and hide under the bed. Or play up on the hill, and Don was with me all the time, of course.
Yeah.
So when Dad found this out, decided Mom couldn't control us, so we had to move back to Ohio. And when we moved back to Ohio,
Because your dad wasn't around, he was
Yeah.
working.
He was working tire, yeah.
Do you know where he lived when he was there?
He lived in a boarding house with the Boyds, Minnie
okay.
Boyd, probably down on Lord Street again. And then we moved back to Ohio, and we moved out to an area called Garden Acres.
Uh-huh.
And we lived in Garden Acres for a while.
So is that a neighborhood or a?
Garden Acres is just the name of a development, and it was basically an area of shacks. It's right out off of 545 near the reformatory, near the prison. And from there we moved out to Oak Street. And I was in the second grade when we moved to Oak Street, because I had been, when we lived in Garden Acres, I went to Newman School for about 2 weeks. And
Why only 2?
well, we moved because they bought the house on Oak Street, and at the time, that's when I got into a big fight with some kids. I mean, I was sitting in my classroom, in my math room, in a math class, as a matter of fact, and I can remember a fight going on out in the playground. I looked out the window, and Don was out there, and he was in the middle of 4 or 5 kids, and they were fighting. They were black kids.
Yeah.
And I just got up, walked out of the classroom, and we got into a big fight with them. And then Mr. Sheets was the principal. He came out, broke it all up, took us all in the office, paddled all the kids, getting ready to paddle me and my brother. And I said, "You're not paddling me. Don't come near me with that paddle." And it was a standoff, so he sent me home. Both of us home. It was the end of the school day. Sent us home to come back the next day with our father, and we moved out on Oak Street that night. So I never saw him again.
Did you move out? Did you move out purposely?
We moved out because we bought the house, and it was just I didn't know what was going on. I just know it was. Came home and.
So you didn't tell? Did you tell your dad you were in trouble?
I don't remember whether I did or not, to be honest with you. I don't remember. Now there was one other place that we lived for a period of time. And that was out on Seminole Avenue in Little Kentucky.
Seminole?
Seminole, just like the Seminole Indians. Out in Little Kentucky, out off Trimble Road, we lived in a house that looked like a Quonset hut. And
What's a Quonset hut look like?
well, it was kind of a rounded type of thing, you know, real long. And there's another place I remember living too. But anyhow, we lived there for a while. It was preschool. It was well before school, because I can remember that place. I can remember what it looked like. It had white shingles on the side, and there were a couple families that we got to know pretty well in the neighborhood. But that was preschool. And then there was another place that we lived right after Dad got out of the Navy. And it might have been after he got out of the Navy, we moved back to Ohio. And before we went to Lucas, we may have lived there for a little while. It was down in a place called Bettsville. That was down off of Route 430 near Mifflin Lake. And it was a veterans kind of an allotment where veterans could live. And they were shared houses. They were big, long houses. And there was an apartment on each end. And we lived there overlooking Mifflin Lake. And it's now called Camp Glenn Taylor. It's used as a Boy Scout camp. So we moved around a lot, which was, I think, very typical of is a very typical thing a lot of Appalachian families at that time did. Trying to find work and trying to find a suitable housing, and most of the places we lived in were substandard. Many of them without plumbing. As a matter of fact, when we moved out on Oak Street, there was no plumbing there. We had no plumbing in the home until I was about 15 years old. We had an outhouse, and we had a hand pump in the house that was set up on a sink, and you had to prime it, pour a little water in, prime it to get the water up. I started playing football when I was in the 5th grade, so I had a place to take a shower.
It's about, you made your own analysis of why you thought you moved around so much as an Appalachian family, looking for work, looking for stability, for suitable housing. What are the other factors that kind of shaped growing up in your house? Give me a sense of, to what you can remember of what role religion played in the family. What did people do for fun? What were the gender relations like, the social relations? See if you can kind of paint a larger picture for me of what was going on.
Well, I came from a large family. I have 4 sisters and a brother. Brother is deceased. My 4 sisters are still living. We moved out on Oak Street when I was in the 2nd grade, and at that time there was myself, Don, and my sister Sue, who's my oldest sister, and Karen was born in the house on Oak Street, okay? And then Linda and Judy were born also when we lived on Oak Street. We went to East Mansfield Elementary School, Madison High School. I went through the 2nd through the 8th grade at East Mansfield. I started participating in athletics, as I said, very young, basically, so that I could get have a place to take a shower. I hated that tub on Saturday night in the kitchen. Our home was heated by coal, a coal furnace. The upstairs where my brother and I stayed and my sisters stayed was unheated and very cold. For a while we rented the upstairs because he needed the extra income. My father worked 2 to 3 jobs all of his life. He always had a full-time job and at least 1 part-time job. Basically because, again, we were a very poor family. My dad could barely read and could write basically unlegible. You could barely understand it. I don't remember ever seeing a written statement from my mother. I don't remember ever seeing my mother sit down and read a newspaper, any of those types of things. We didn't have literature in our home. The Bible was all. We did subscribe to the newspaper off and on, and I think that came about basically because he ran the newspaper route my dad did as a part-time job. Did a lot of part-time jobs. Newspaper route, taxi cab driver, worked on farm, part-time work in construction. I mean,
he'd do just about anything to make ends meet.
Anything he could to make ends meet. Didn't manage money real well.
I mean, was that due to just the lack of knowledge as to how to do it, or was there?
I think there was a lack of knowledge of how to do it, and I think there were just expenses that were above and beyond in terms of a large family. Always bought a side of beef or a full pig, butchered pig, that type of thing, in order to provide stability. Raised a huge garden. Matter of fact, if we didn't raise a garden, we probably would have starved to death. So the freezer was always full. Grew up in a family. I won't say my mother and father were overly affectionate. They never showed a lot of affection, but they were very caring people and would have put it on the line in a heartbeat for their kids. Not a lot of hugging and kissing took place, that type of thing. Different than my own philosophy and approach to my children. When I see them, I hug them.
That didn't happen.
That didn't happen.
Did you shake your dad's hand?
Yes. Yes.
Did you ever want to hug him when you shook his hand?
Thought never really occurred to me, to be honest with you. When we moved out on Oak Street, prior to the day we moved out there, we were living in Garden Acres. My dad came in drunk that night. The only time.
This before?
It's the only time I can remember seeing him drunk. I know he was a drinker in his youth.
Yeah.
Don and I were in bed. We shared a bed. Matter of fact, we shared a double bed up until probably 15, 16 years old before we got twin beds. Heard a thump. Got up to go see what was going on. Dad was laying stretched across the kitchen floor, and Mom was standing there in a nightgown. Dad just gotten off work, come home, and he was drunk, and he passed out. And I can remember my brother Don, who couldn't pronounce my name very clearly, looking at me and saying, "Dud? Daddy dead." And Mom saying, "No, but that son of a bitch ought to be." Well, anyhow, we moved out to Oak Street the next day, and
So did this correspond with you having gotten in trouble at school
Yeah.
also? So that was a big day.
and it may have been that I didn't tell him because he was drunk. So anyhow, we moved out on Oak Street the next day, and I remember Dad setting up the bed, and he went to bed, and we moved the rest of the house in because he was hungover. But that was the last time he drank. After that, he got associated with the Southern Baptist Church, hard shell, fundamentalist Southern Baptist Church, and he was raised in that church as a kid. His father, my grandfather, was a preacher, okay? Self-ordained preacher. There wasn't anything like going to school or any of that stuff. It was self-ordained, and it
He
was...
just had the calling.
He had the calling. And my grandmother and my father was one of 13 children.
So
That was
this
James Castle.
James
Yes,
Castle
yes.
in Kentucky.
And my grandmother was Amanda. And
And
my
Amanda's the one who, looking at her pictures,
looks very Native
looks like
American.
an Indian woman.
Yes. And if you had seen her, my great-grandmother, Sarah Jenkins, and you would have said that she was Native American. They both look very Native American, as did my great-grandfather, and I can't pronounce his name, Esbanera.
Esbaneri.
Matter of fact, I met Esbaneri and I met Sarah Jenkins as great-grandparents, and I was in the room the night my great-grandfather Esbaneri died.
How old was he?
He was quite old. I can't tell you how old he was, but he looked old. He looked ancient. But see, a lot of those folks down there that live in that part of the country looked older than they were because of the hardships of life.
Yeah.
So I really can't tell you how old he was. I honestly don't know.
What's the memory of you? How old were you and what happened when
I don't know how old.
he died?
I don't know how old I was, but I remember Don and I had spent the night with them, and they lived again in one of those little shacks that had 2 bedrooms, 2 rooms downstairs with a double bed on each side of a big fireplace. The fireplace separated the 2 rooms, and a kitchen in the back, and a loft upstairs to sleep in. And I remember waking up in the morning and being told to run over to the house, the big house, and tell them over there that Grandpa had died. And I remember waking up and seeing someone tie a white rag around his head, looked like rabbit ears, and that was, of course, to hold his jaw closed shut so it didn't stay open and rigor mortis set in and make it difficult for the undertaker, and putting pennies on his eyes. And I can remember my father, your grandfather, carrying him along with other relatives, holding him above their head, carrying him across a rain-swollen creek to get him up to the ambulance to take him into Paintsville for to the funeral home.
So that'd be a pretty powerful image because they're carrying his body, not like in a coffin. or
No,
anything.
no, they have his body wrapped in a white sheet. And I can remember that happened. Anyhow, we moved out on Oak Street, to get back to what we were saying. My father got involved in this religion and went through the throes of it. I remember seeing my father baptized down in Kentucky,
So was he considered born again?
born again,
Because he got away from it.
born again. My mother then accepted the same religion, and that was very normal for both husband and wife to become subjects of the church. And I guess the thing that bothered me, and this is probably the biggest strain between me and my father in terms of our relationship, was that of religion. I couldn't buy the religion, okay? My dad often referred to me as an educated fool. But I couldn't buy that religion and chose not to. And that created a lot of strain. My brother had the same mentality. We had a real difficult go with that in terms of Dad. And it put quite a strain on us growing up as kids. So I think for that reason, we both got very immersed in school, very immersed in athletics, and I was involved in something athletic all year long. Baseball in the summer, football, wrestling or basketball, track and field, you know, all the time. It was a constant go. And probably athletics were my salvation If I hadn't been involved in athletics, I probably would have been in prison. Okay? But that kept me on an even keel. It allowed me to associate with good friends. A guy named Bruce Desterhalf was a very good friend. We used to walk together a lot to get to practice from our homes. We would meet and walk several miles to get back and forth to practices and games. Dick Enderly, another good friend. Dick Flick, another good friend. Flick was the one with money, Flick and Enderly. Desterhalf, they were financially better off than we were. But anyhow, religion played a very strong role, and it was scary because it's a very emotional, hand clapping, crying, and God's a vengeful God in this religion. You screw up, He's going to get you. You got to be born again if you want the pathway to heaven, that kind of stuff. And religion it was at the point where religion became the overpowering issue in our home. And I felt that at times my family, my folks, my dad in particular, put religion before he put family. Because there were times when Sunday they would have church somewhere and everybody would come back to our house for dinner, and all the church people got to eat first and the kids ate last.
Was there enough food? And
sometimes there wasn't a heck of a lot left, I can remember being chased out of my bed so that somebody from the church could sleep in my bed.
No matter who it was.
Didn't make any difference. So I really resented that as I grew up. I respect my father and my mother for their staunchness and their ability to stick to it, and my dad would have given me the shirt off his back. There's no question about that. Family was very important to him, but he had a very difficult time showing emotion until later in life. As he got older, there was a greater emotional attachment. And of course, when I was growing up, if I stepped out of line, I got thrashed. It was with a belt or with a switch. Go out and cut your own switch. Now, of course, knowing what I know today, if back in those days I'd have cut the corner off a little piece of newspaper and given it to, go ahead, Dad, beat me to death. But if I didn't get a switch big enough, I had to go back and get another one.
So tell me, it sounds like there's a lot of contradictions that maybe you were aware of and you didn't even necessarily realize it when you were younger, but to see, for example, to have a dearth of emotion or a lack of emotion from your father, yet you'd see him in church with this overabundance of emotion. Do you remember that registering on you? Is that...
Not really.
No?
Not really. It may have, but I don't remember that. My brother and I were very tight when we were kids. We were like the Bobbsey twins. We took care of, and I think for the most part I took care of him. And made sure that he was safe and that type of thing. I really felt that I took the role of the big brother with my siblings, my sisters. Fortunately, my two younger sisters I didn't spend a lot of time with because I got off to college before they were really up and out. So I didn't get a chance to spend time with them during their formative teenage years.
Well, what made you feel that role was so necessary? Because you can see it in the way your sisters relate to you, and obviously the way you describe it. Was there something missing to a degree that maybe religion took from you as a family unit where you stepped in?
I don't know. I could have. It could very well have been that my lack of respect for the religious belief of my family, of my mom and dad. It could very well have been that I felt the need to protect my sisters and my brothers from that, to be their protector, to kind of swoop them in here and not let them be subject to that.
What do you think, we're just fishing here, thinking, this is kind of your analysis of the period, not necessarily what you remembered, but in terms of, it's a pretty young age at which you start to, instead of being taken in to this religious experience or this way of life, you're repelled from it. what are, you've elaborated a little bit, but I don't know, what are the factors that pushed you away rather than took you in? And it sounds like where you were pushed, you filled that with education and sports.
I just couldn't believe in it. It was scary. It was very scary to me. I didn't like the emotion. I couldn't handle seeing people, jump up and shout and walk around and cry and that type of stuff. I think it frightened me initially more than anything else. And I guess because as I was exposed to different people, different friends, coaches, teachers, who were a big influence in my life. I saw a way of life that was different than what I was dealing with, and thought that maybe was a better way. I really can't tell you. I honestly don't know, but I know I became immersed in school. I was president of my class my junior and senior year. I played football, as I mentioned before. I played some basketball. I was involved in some wrestling. Ran some track, played baseball in the summer. I started playing baseball when I was about 8 years old, and probably was my best sport. I don't know why I didn't pursue it. But it was through football that I ended up getting an opportunity to go to college. Had I not played football, I probably would never have gone to school. I played 4 years of college football. Didn't necessarily excel, but I lettered a couple of years and was a part of a program that I felt very comfortable with. Had two terrible college coaches, but I'll elaborate on that maybe at another time. But I grew up very independent, and maybe that independency came about as a result of feeling the need to push away from the religious belief. I'm not sure, but pretty independent. My brother and I, as I mentioned, were very close early on. Later on in life, we became kind of competitive with each other. Him more so than me, I think, wanting to, constantly one-up type of thing. Educationally, I think as a family we've made great strides. My mother and father were basically illiterate. Not ignorant, but illiterate.
Well, they just hadn't been to school.
No, my dad, I think if either my mother or father had a chance for education, I think could have been very brilliant people. A lot of they use good common sense most of the time.
But when you say, I think this is important to point out, we're not just talking about not a chance to go to college, right? When people often think about not educated, we're talking about Grandpa maybe making it to third grade.
I think I don't know whether he even got that far, and I don't really know what
never really having had formal education.
No.
Either one of them.
No, and I don't know what my mother's status was in terms of school. As I said, I don't remember ever seeing her write a letter, write a note.
So we don't even know that they could read the Bible necessarily.
Well,
they could listen to sermonizing.
I can remember my father sitting down and stumbling through the Bible, and I learned a lot about the Bible because I read the Bible to him a lot. So I had
Did
a pretty.
that influence you also?
I don't know whether it influenced me necessarily. I see the Bible as a good history book. Okay, I don't know how accurate it is, but as a history book, but I read the Bible to him. I read the newspaper to them, and I think that with my Bible school teacher that we had in public school at that time, Mrs. Shook, she used to come in with the flannel boards and put Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego up on the boards, and talk. So I had a pretty good knowledge of the Bible. But I really don't know what totally turned me against a religion, and I think part of it was that I felt that the religion superseded family.
Okay.
I didn't like eating last. I didn't like giving up.
Especially when you didn't have much in the first place.
That's right.
It's not like it was a disrespect. It's not like you wanted to be in front. It was you wanted to eat. I mean, there's a difference between.
I wanted food.
You're not selfish, or it's not about dignity or respect. It's about feeling protected, about feeling like you're number one, and you need to feel that from your family.
Yeah, I guess you're probably right. That probably sums it up as well as anything. But anyhow, we didn't have much in terms of a television. Didn't have much at home. I mean, we had furniture was usually bought from Bing's Furniture, which was a discount furniture store, or used furniture. I can remember having a television with a little round screen, and then later on, of course, we had television. And remember the old house when we moved into it on Oak Street? It was a typical old farmhouse. I loved the place. Had a big summer kitchen in the back where they used to butcher and can and all that good stuff.
And on Oak Street?
On Oak Street.
Did it have it anymore when I saw it? I don't remember any summer kitchen.
No, you wouldn't remember it because that was enclosed. That's where the bathroom became and Grandma and Grandpa's bedroom.
Okay.
Okay? And prior to that, it was just a big old summer kitchen back there, and that's where they used to butcher and can and that type of thing. The house had sliding doors, and there was some furniture in there that I wish I still had. Very antique-ish stuff. Of course, time, no big deal. But you know, my father struggled most of his time, most of his life. I think the only thing he ever really knew in life was work, and his only real joy in life was his religion. So I have to respect it from that standpoint, that it did give him solace in terms of dealing with life. It gave him some, gave him a basis, a foundation, or something to keep him solid ground.
Yeah.
But they struggled most of their life. And experienced some difficult times as a result of a broken back and, you know, the tire closing down, losing his Mansfield Tire pension because they closed, and, you know, all those kind of things were very, very difficult for him. I was the first in our family to graduate from high school that I'm aware of, okay? Let alone go and get a college degree. And I never really thought of going to school until after a football game, and one of the coaches from the Ohio Conference came in. I think it was a coach from Muskingum College, Sherman, I believe his name was. Came by my locker and made a comment to me that he played a good ball game tonight, number 80. And where are you going to go to school next year? And at that point I said to him, I said, I hadn't really thought about it. I was a senior. Hadn't really thought about it. I think I probably will go to work at the Mansfield Tire, where my dad works. He said, that's a shame. I think you could play in the Ohio Conference. So as
You
I
knew what that was?
I didn't at the time. So as I walked home that night, I got to thinking, God, I wonder if I could go to school. So I went to school on Monday, and I met with my counselor, Bill Follett, and another lady by the name of Martha Ferry, and they paid for and made arrangements for me to take the ACT. I took it over at Worcester College. That was the second college campus I'd ever been on. I went to Ohio University when I went to Buckeye Boys State at the end of my junior year, down at Ohio U in Athens. But Worcester went over. I remember driving over. I remember how independent I felt when I got the car and I drove over by myself and took the test. Must have done fairly well. Didn't start school until January, though, because I didn't have any money, and I ended up going to Marietta College. I don't know how I ended up there, to be honest with you. I know they must have offered me some financial assistance, and ended up playing four years of football there, and got my degree in education with a major concentration in the field of biology, and became a biology science teacher in Mansfield schools in 1965. And from there, of course, my brother, Don, he bounced around a lot. He went to Fairmont State College in West Virginia. Didn't like it there. He ended up going from there to Ashland, and from Ashland ended up at University of Akron, where he got his bachelor's degree, and he played football at Fairmont and at Akron. And Don went on later to achieve his doctorate. My sisters, all four sisters, are high school graduates. One, I think, Linda, has an associate's degree, or close to it. And probably for a family, when you think about it, for a family whose mother and father were basically illiterate, you know, we have accomplished a lot educationally. And from there, of course, my own children, my daughter Beth, has a doctorate, and my son Michael has his bachelor's. My sister Linda's niece has her master's degree. My sister Sue's son Brian has his bachelor's degree. Who else? Eric, my sister Judy's son, is now in college at Ohio State. And Chris and Jeff, my brother's boys, both have their master's degrees. So, you know, from that standpoint, from you know, once we broke the barrier, you know, it went from there. And I think, you know, my brother and I are both classic examples of going to how you go to school when you don't have any money, because we didn't have anything. You know, when I was in school, my mom and dad, when I was in Marietta for the first 2 years, my mother and father sent me $5 a week. And that's what I subsisted on, so until I got jobs on campus. My brother is under the same situation. And, you know, most of what we got was earned through athletics, and that's made a major difference for us.
So athletics and working hard, you know, scholastically. I mean, you weren't just sports guys. I mean, you weren't dummies. You didn't excel in school, but you did very well, and you also had leadership.
I didn't apply myself as well as I could have in college, and I think a part of that reason...
Well, I meant in high school to get to college.
High school, I graduated 5th in my class.
Well, you did very good.
And I'm not sure where Don graduated, but I was a class of 175. And but when I got to college, I think basically because as a kid, I had very little. My social contacts were all basically associated with athletics. Okay, I didn't go to a lot of dances.
Right.
Didn't have girlfriends.
In high school, you didn't?
No, I went. I took a girl to the junior prom. I think. No, I didn't. No, I didn't go to the junior prom. I took a girl to the senior prom. I went to the junior prom as junior class president long enough to make a speech and welcome the seniors, and then I left. And the senior prom, same thing. When I had a track meet the next day, so I didn't, you know, we didn't stay very long. Took this girl for a couple hours and then took her home. So I didn't date.
Why? What happened with your ears? When you were younger?
My face grew into my ears.
Your ears stuck out a lot. However, now they don't do so.
My face grew into my ears.
Okay, so it finally caught up.
And I think also I wore my hair cut high and tight here, flat top. Used to be, it was bald here. Now that was by a haircut. Now it's bald naturally. So, you know, that was just something I didn't do. I didn't have clothes, didn't have money, so I didn't bother with it.
You couldn't date anyway. You couldn't take a girl out on a date because you'd have to pay for it.
I didn't have a car. Didn't have wheels to do that with. We were a one-car family, and Dad used that basically to get back and forth to work.
Well, what did religion say about dating and sexuality?
Well, my sisters were not allowed, and my mother never wore pants. You know, they wore dresses and skirts all through school.
Well, other women were wearing pants at this time.
Mm-hmm. And my mother never wore, I don't remember seeing her in trousers until after my father broke his back, and Mom and Dad started working together, you know, in a cleaning position. Okay?
Well, I have a question from our viewing audience.
Yeah?
That says, there is some history or something that occurred with a girl that you brought home to live with you.
Yeah. For a while, she was a homeless waif, and felt sorry for her family and kicked her out, and I brought her home.
How old was she and how old were you?
I think it was in college. Maybe, it wasn't high school yet. It might have been high school, I don't know. Maybe it might have been my senior year.
Of high school?
Yeah, might have been.
Where did you meet her?
I don't remember. All I know is that she got kicked out. It was associated with somebody that I was running with, and the family had kicked her out. And she
So-
lived with us for a while and stole us blind.
Mom, go ahead and ask. Mom, go ahead. Mom, mother,
What?
what is it that
He
you
says-
know?
Nothing, he says girl, you might think he's talking about a young girl. He's not talking about a young girl.
I don't know how old she was.
17?
I don't know, her name was Sandy, I know that. I don't remember her last name.
So was this a combination, was this a savior effort, were you being a kind person?
Well, I
Or was
was-
she cute and you wanted to bring her home and see if
I
you could have sex
think it was a
with
savior effort. I used to bring animals home all the time. I'd find dogs and cats.
her? It's good. Please don't put that on the dog, okay? That makes noise. That's why I took it off the dog.
So and as I said, I don't remember the circumstances, to be honest with you, at this point in time.
So
But
you-
I do remember bringing her home, and Mom and Dad brought her into the household. She lived with us for maybe a month.
Did your parents find that to be unusual? I mean,
My
because if
parents-
they're pretty religious,
My parents would take people in all the time.
so they take them in just.
They'd take people in all the time. Used to feed hobos. You know, we lived in Lucas. I can remember hobos, people that would ride the rails, stopping in to, and Mom would feed them breakfast, dinner, things like that.
So they were just generous.
Well, they'd share anything. I mean, didn't have anything, but they would share anything they had.
Right.
And we used to take in boarders, people who would rent a bedroom in the house. I can't remember the guy. Dempsey Craig was his name. That's the guy I went after with a shotgun because he grabbed my brother because Don hit him with an apple. And I went after him with my dad's 12-gauge shotgun. I didn't know whether it was loaded or not, but I told him to back off my brother. I'd blow his damn brains out.
For hitting Don with an apple.
Well, Don and I were in an apple fight, okay? We used to throw apples at each other all the time. You hide around the corner and peek around, throw those apples. And
Wouldn't that hurt?
sometimes when it hits you, yeah. And Don threw one at me and it missed and it hit Dempsey. And I don't know why that name came back to me all of a sudden, but it did. And he grabbed my brother. He was just shaking him around. And I went in the house and I knew where Dad's old 12-gauge was and I got it and brought it out. I cocked it. And as I said, I'm sure it wasn't loaded, but I don't know.
Right,
And when Dad got home, Dempsey told him, and of course I got thrashed.
right.
And Don got thrashed for hitting him with the apple, and then Dad kicked him out of the house.
So punishment all around.
Yep. But there were other boarders in the house. There were a multitude of people, plus a lot of Dad's family. Mom and Dad both their families would come up from Kentucky and work for a period of time and would stay with us. I mean, Herb stayed with us for a while. That was my dad's brother. Raymond stayed with us for a while. James stayed with us for a while. Bob moved up and stayed with us for a while. My mother's brother, half-brother, Junior, he stayed with us for a while. When we were in Lucas, my aunt Easter and Coy and my cousin Ron, they lived in the upstairs of the apartment, of the house. We lived in the downstairs. And we lived in the downstairs, you know, and I don't know whether, I guess we shared the rent. So, you know, growing up, there was always somebody. Even when we lived out on Oak Street, I can remember renting the upstairs to two different families. One
Same
was,
time?
no. I can't remember who the first one who the first people were. But I do remember the second was Clayton and his wife, Clayton Phipps, would be my second cousin. They rented the place for a while.
So there was a significant presence of extended family around
Mm-hmm.
often. I mean, that's kind of a very tribal thing. That's what makes, you know, there's a similar connection to family and space that, you know, Appalachian
Mhm.
families have as do, you know, Native families where, you know, it's pretty fluid. You share what you have.
Never closed the door. I mean, it was always open. And I kind of resented that because I thought they took advantage of Mom and Dad, advantage of them financially, and advantage of our home. And again, I felt at times because of these people living there that us kids we're playing second fiddle, okay? And I resented that. Okay?
Did, you were talking a little bit, but we moved into another direction about gender, and it sounds like, because it's pretty significant that you and your brother achieve such high levels of education, yet all of your sisters don't.
Well, I think the thing that prevailed at that time was that as a woman you didn't need an education. I mean, my mother worked for a very short period of time when they first moved to Mansfield, and that may have even been before I was born, you know. I'm not sure, but she worked for a short period of time in a factory and never worked again. I don't remember her ever working outside the home until after my father broke his back and they went into the cleaning business. Again, my mother always wore dresses. Was never allowed to wear shorts, never allowed to wear slacks. Couldn't cut their hair because religion said not to. My sisters were not allowed to cut their hair. They always wore dresses and skirts. And kind of played a subservient role, and I think that was very normal for families that moved out of the hills of Kentucky.
I mean, do you remember language or comments or statements about things that aren't appropriate for girls to do? I mean, were there times where it's like, could they not run around?
They weren't allowed to run around. They weren't allowed to date a lot. I know that's part of the reason my sisters, the three older ones in particular, Sue, Karen, and Linda, went through a wild period, and that wild period meant slipping out of the house and that type of thing, and you know, lying and telling stories in order to be able to go hang out somewhere.
Right.
One of the things that the social pieces with me when I was a kid, my brother and me both, was that we had an African American family that lived just up the street from us, by the name of Atwater, Madeline and James Atwater. Their boys Vincent, and then there was Reed, and I think there was a Dwight. And we spent a lot of time, for some reason, with the Atwaters.
Was that unusual?
I don't know if it was unusual. I never really thought about it. But Madeline, who's still alive, and I have visited her recently, taught me every card game in the books, and it's kind of ironic that in my last year in education, her nephew was my assistant principal, Fred Atwater.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so I hung out with those folks a lot when I was a kid.
Well, when I say, is that unusual, were there a lot of, you know, young white, you know, boys, Appalachian boys, spending time with black boys?
No, not really. As a matter of fact, the school that I went to, Madison, I only remember one black kid there. It was a kid named Jimmy Jerome. And I went through elementary with him and high school, and he was the only one that I remember. And I don't remember whether he graduated from high school, whether he graduated with our class or not. But we lived just off of a black neighborhood, you know, out off of East 2nd Street on Oak Street. And there was an elderly black lady that lived down the street from us, maybe a quarter of a mile, by the name of Mrs. Butler. Lived at the corner of Davidson and Oak Street. Nicest old lady I've ever met, just as sweet as pie. And I got to know her when I knocked on her door to try to sell her some magazines for a school fund drive. And then from that time on, I would do little favors for her. I'd go down and help her with her lawn, or sweep off her porch, or you know, do those kinds of things. And we got to be, I won't say great friends, but we got to be friends.